Can everybody hear me okay? Am I on? No, can you hear me okay? He gave me a thumbs up, so I assumed that meant I was on. All right, folks, it is 9 o'clock. No, well, what time do I start? 9:30. So we're going to go ahead and begin. I think we've got some folks I have never seen before, so I will very quickly kind of summarize what we're talking about this quarter. So we are diving into the book of Psalms, and we're focusing on the sorts of prayer that we find in Psalms. Specifically, today we're talking about the individual lament, which is something that we don't really think about in our prayer today. We don't really think about complaining to God or bargaining with God. We ask Him for things, but we don't really say, if you do this, then I will do that. But this is something that we find a lot of in the book of Psalms, and so we're taking the Psalms as a template, an example for how we should pray. And so obviously take a little bit of getting used to with our new setup. We've got all the computer stuff in the back now, so I won't be taking care of the song slides once we get going with worship. And so it'll take a little bit of getting used to on my end. But like I say, this is what we'll be talking about today, the individual lament. I think next week we'll be talking about individual praise. The week after that we'll be talking about communal lament, lamenting as a church, as a group, and then communal praise to finish things off in the next 4 weeks. So we always begin the lesson with a couple of opening questions to kind of get our minds kind of where we're headed with this lesson. And so the first question is, and this is rhetorical, or you can answer the question. It's really just to kind of get your mind thinking. The first question is, can you think of an occasion where you offered a real gut-level lament prayer? How would you describe it, and what were your innermost thoughts? All right, so kind of just be thinking about this as we go through the lesson today. So far in our study, we have discovered through the Psalms that Israel approached God boldly expressing its desires and needs, and this will intensify as we discuss the individual complaint or individual lament. And this is not surprising, as the I-thou relationship is strongest between God and the individual. So I need to step back for our guests and kind of explain these three terms that we talk about a lot in this class. So I'm taking this lesson from a Bible teacher at Faulkner University, where I graduated from, Dr. Bailey. And so he's got these three terms that we talk about a lot in the class. We talk about social reality, which is just what does our worship look like, which can change depending on what kind of church you're going to, whether you're in the old law or the new law. And so that's one thing that we talk about a lot. So that's social reality. Piety simply means, how do you view God, and how does your view of God change? And then the I-thou relationship just means the relationship between the individual and God, or the church and God. So with personal prayer, the I-thou relationship is strongest between God and the individual. In this social reality, this personal social reality, the individual is one-on-one with God. There is no audience, making this an intensely personal conversation. And the distance may be... may have a little trouble with the remote being as far away as it is. Oh, there we go. The individual may feel free to express his or her feelings in a way that might make us feel uncomfortable, especially in front of others. There's a cartoon in a church bulletin one time that illustrates how we should approach God in a lament, humbly and respectfully, but directly. In this cartoon, there's a young girl who's saying her prayers before she goes to bed. She's kneeling beside her bed. And as she's saying her prayers, she remarks, "And now I'd like to tell you about some of the things I'm not thankful for." In her most private one-on-one with God, she expressed some feelings that one might not express publicly. Given our negative view of complaints to God, many people might feel similarly uncomfortable about expressing such thoughts to Him. And so this is an area of our prayer lives we should look to improve upon. And that's what we're trying to do today. So, to study and observe the major characteristics of individual prayer, we should be familiar with the following elements of an individual lament psalm. These include the following, although not all of these occur in every psalm. And they're not always in this order. So, first, we have the address, which establishes contact. It opens a door. It's a direct call. For instance, the psalmist says, "O God," or "O Lord," or something of this sort. There is a cry for hearing, essentially, "Hear my cry," or "my prayer," or "my plea." There's a plaint, where the psalmist or the person giving the prayers tells God what it's like to be in this situation, and he asks God why. This includes talking about the state of the petitioner, the conduct of the enemy, and action or inaction by God. We've got a petition. Phrased generally, it's for the petitioner against the enemy. We've got a motivation clause in which you try to influence God for a favorable response. There's a vow. Like I mentioned earlier, if God will do this, then the plaintiff will do this in return. There's a certainty of hearing. I mentioned this last week. There's an expression of confidence that your prayer was heard. Oh, there we go. There's an anticipatory praise, a promise to praise when your prayer is granted. And finally, there's confession of sin and imprecation. All right, so those are all things we're going to see in an individual prayer of lament. Like I say, not all of these are going to be in every prayer, and they're not always going to be in this order that we've got listed here. But at least some of these characteristics will be in every individual lament. All right, so we're going to use Psalm 13 as an example, and we've got the first two verses here. This is the opening and the complaint. So for most of the remainder of the class, we're going to take the elements we were just talking about and apply them to this particular psalm. So the opening and the complaint we see in verses 1 and 2 are comprised of the repeated question, "How long?" It implies an interruption in the status quo, a dissatisfaction, and impatience on the part of the complaint, the person doing the complaint. The opening quickly moves into the complaint proper, set off by this question, "How long?" So we've got, "How long will you forget me forever, O Lord? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?" So the opening and the complaint involve accusations to God. And these are very human, natural questions for somebody who is suffering to ask. Clearly these questions are divided into essentially three categories. You've got those relating to God. That's the first two questions there. There's a question relating to the self, the person making the complaint. That's the third one. And then there's one relating to the enemy, which is the last one there. They indicate a genuine relationship with God, characterized by the lamenter boldly and clearly expressing his feelings. And so next we've got the plaint or the petition in verses 3 and 4. It reads, "Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken." Now, watch this relationship between the first two verses and the last two. The opening and the complaint found in the first two verses on the left side of this chart here. And then you've got the petition in the third and fourth on the right, in which the supplicant asked God to fix the problem explicitly. And consider how the relationship lines up in this table. So on the left, in the opening complaint in verse 1, we've got, "How long will you forget me forever? And how long will you hide your face from me?" And then to go with that, you've got, in the first part of verse 3, you've got, "Consider and answer me." Then, on the left, you've got part of the complaint, "How long must I bear my pain in my soul?" The answer is, "Light up my eyes, or I sleep the sleep of death." By the way, reading this, it feels like there's an angsty teenager writing this psalm. Only a teenager would use the phrase, "I sleep the sleep of death." On the left, you've got, "How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?" And the answer is, "Let my enemy say, I have prevailed over, my foes will rejoice because I am shaken." So the supplicant boldly and specifically petitions God to fix the situation, to stop the suffering and his possible death. The foundational assumption to these petitions is the belief that the psalmist's petitions regarding his suffering affected God in some way. Further, they demonstrate that human beings cannot always stand uniformly near to God, that God may be remote, and the supplicant desires to establish a closer relationship to God by way of his petitions, which hopefully God will grant. Now we have the motivational clause in verse 5, and it reads, "But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation." We'll also have the certainty of hearing in a moment as well, which indicates that the individual has bargained with God. In this bargain, he attempts to obligate God to grant his requests. Specifically, he describes to God in the complaints and states what he wants God to do in the petitions. And so this concludes with the promise to rejoice in your salvation. Oops, getting ahead of myself. And sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. That last part from verse 6 may be considered the certainty of hearing. Therefore, the bargain is straightforward and based on the background assumption. It can be stated simply as, "I will tell God that I've trusted him in the past, and I will praise him in the future. Therefore, he should answer my prayer." Such bargaining, again, seems foreign to us and seems maybe a little bit presumptuous, but it is, however, the nature of the psalmist's motivational clause there in verse 5. It is respectful, but direct and honest. This individual, like Hannah in 1 Samuel, possess a social reality and a piety that places responsibility on the supplicant and God, in which the supplicant obligates himself to do certain things, and then he expects reciprocity from God. So these are the rest of the individual lament psalms. Obviously, that's a lot. We can't go through all of them. Psalm 13 was just an example of an individual lament. I meant to include these on the handout, but I forgot to put them on there. So if you want to take your phone and take a picture of this slide, if you want to go back and read these at a later time, we'll take a moment for anybody that wants to take a picture. You can do that now. This may end up being the shortest class of our 12 weeks. So now we go to our reflection questions. First, and this can apply to any of these individual lament psalms. What was the major threat to the individual in this particular psalm? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Unnamed enemies. Did you say something, David? Wants forgiveness? Oh, so don't forget me. Yes. He's also specifically concerned about dying as well. Seems to be on his mind. Mm-hmm. He maybe feels God. What did the individual particularly ask for in this psalm? Definitely to be remembered. Asking for a response. And to be delivered from his enemies, as we said. Did the individual accuse God or hold God responsible in any way? Mm-hmm. There's kind of it seems like we see this a lot in these Psalms, where on the one hand, you start with, how long will you forget me forever? And then at the end, he's talking about how I do trust you to remember me, right? So it's like the psalmist, even in this short psalm, it's only six verses long, it feels like he's conflicted, you know? He feels the doubt on the one hand, but then he has this trust on the other hand. And so this is just me saying this, but I kind of feel like there's an inner conflict with this person between his heart and his head. He feels like he's been abandoned and betrayed, but he knows in his head, in his what he knows logically, that God will be there for him. And so that is, personally for me, that is something that I have to struggle with. You know, things don't always go my way, and I feel like God has left me in the lurch sometimes. But I believe in the Bible. I believe in what it says, and it says that God is going to be there for us. Yes.
I think it's interesting to remember David's whole life. I mean, it started when he started his life, and it was based on his trust in God. How he was selected to be the king
Mm-hmm.
was a process that God was directly involved in. And even as he was facing persecution from Saul, trust
there's a difference because, there was a time when people audibly heard God speak back to them, and that would be a huge boost to my faith. But he doesn't work that way now, so you're right. Our faith maybe works a little bit harder now. Now, as far as David goes, my mind always goes back to the 51st Psalm, which is probably when David is at his lowest point because of the whole deal with Bathsheba and the baby dying. And granted, that situation was because of him, not because of anything God had done or allowed to do. But, it's very powerful to read, David asking God to create a clean heart in him, Yeah. Anything else? And our salvation is different from David's, right? He didn't have the promise of heaven, but we do. So it should be even more for us than what it was for him. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Yes. So we always need to remember that this is a prayer, but it's also still poetry. So they do have room for exaggeration and things like that as well. But you're right, it does feel like forever, especially if you're surrounded by enemies that maybe want your head, Our enemies act a little differently today for the most part, but the attitude sometimes is the same. Anything else? All right. Did the individual bring pressures on God or bargain with God in any way to force God to deal with the situation? I don't think it's as obvious in this psalm as it maybe is in others. But in 3 and 4 it says, "Consider and answer me, O Lord, light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest the enemy say I've prevailed over him. And then verse 5, I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. And I think it's understood that if you help me, this is what I'm going to do. You know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How did the individual expect God to change the situation? Mm-hmm. 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 Definitely. Definitely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so the answer to our question here can actually be found in the first two verses. It's just the opposite of, what it actually says. He wants God to remember him instead of forget him. He wants help, and he wants counsel instead of having to rely on his own wits. He wants to be delivered from the enemy. Did the individual reflect with himself or talk to himself about anything? I don't think so. Like I say, these are general questions that can be asked of any one of those psalms, but I don't think it applies to this particular. Well, I don't know. Verse 6 says, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So that seems like an internal counsel. Visualization questions. Can this psalm or any part of it function as a model for any current concerns that we may privately express to God? Do you find that you could substitute any part of this psalm for any prayer that you might give? indeed. This does take a measure of intention. And so I think I might have mentioned this in one of the first two lessons, but I think that having the song lends itself very well to prayer, because you do have to think about the word choice, the word order. And so you're really, really thinking about what you're writing. And so I may end up, in my own prayer life, I may end up doing my prayers like a poem, just to be able to focus on what it is that I'm trying to get across. But that might just end up being me. How does this psalm differ from any of your private prayers to God in times of crisis? Generally speaking, what do your lament prayers look like? Do they sound like David in any way? Are they a little bit more timid, perhaps? I know mine are, if I'm honest. It's assumed. Well, then on the other hand, you've got the most famous prayer, or one of the most famous prayers, explicitly says, "Your will be done." When Jesus prays that, he doesn't want to die on the cross, he says, "Your will be done," but it's also explicit that he's trying to get God to change his mind about that. And so I don't know that we really think about that prayer in that way. We just kind of focus on your will be done and not the drops of blood that Jesus was sweating in the process. No, he didn't. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's like we keep saying, several weeks we've said this, God is very much like our earthly parents who want to know, they want to hear all of our feelings. They don't want to just hear about the good things in our lives. And God is the same way. So we've got a book full of, shall we say, cheeky psalmists to our perspective. But God doesn't strike, like you say, doesn't strike any of them with lightning, to our knowledge. Can you think of a time when you had similar feelings toward God about some sort of problem? Are such feelings acceptable to us, to God? I think we just kind of talked about that. God does not. He won't strike us dead if we question him. feel like my mic is coming and going. As long as we do approach him, with humility and with the right attitude, And then we've got some action questions, some suggestions for how to deal with this subject in the course of this week. So if you want to, I'd like to suggest that you pray explicitly, boldly, and faithfully each day about a problem with which you are dealing. Express exactly how you feel about it to God, knowing that because of Christ, He understands. Then look to see how God answered your prayers, and keep a diary of your prayer life this week, or write down the prayers you pray. At the end of the week, read over your diary or prayers and list the following things: what you would ask for differently, what you would not ask for at all, and the things for which God deserves praise. This week, read and reflect on piety in terms of lament and its relationship to praise. Attempt to express yourself boldly in your prayers as the Hebrew writers admonished. And I got ahead of myself. I actually noted those scriptures. So Philippians 4, 7, and 8 reads, "And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, pure, lovely, commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things." And then Hebrews 4, 15, and 16, we talked about in the first week. "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." All right. Thank you very much for your attention. Are there any final questions or comments? All right. We'll talk about, I think it's individual praise next week, and then individual communal lament and communal praise. And I think communal lament will be the most difficult, because we can see, it's very easier for us to complain to God as individuals, less so as a church. So that one I'm especially looking forward to. All right. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.